So now we get to the fun stuff, right? How all these cells, tissues, and organs are actually helping to defend the body. Now, when we think about body defense, you really have two main ways that this works, right? We have what are called the innate defenses. That's one branch, right? Again, we're trying to destroy antigens. Those are going to be a surface protein on our pathogen. Innate defenses can do that, or we see adaptive defenses, right? So we have the same end goal, but the way these two sides of the defense system works is fairly different. So our innate defenses innate refers to something that you're born with. Okay? So like your skin acts as a barrier for pathogen entry to the body. That's an innate defense, right? It's still protecting you, but it's something you're born with. The other thing I'll say about innate defenses is they are non-specific. Meaning it does not matter if it's a parasitic worm, a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, like what we're dealing with, right? If it's foreign, these innate defenses are going to try to destroy it, right? So it's not dependent on having been exposed to this pathogen before. Our adaptive defenses constitutes our true immune system. Right? Because think about what immunity means, or to be immune to something, right? It means it's not going to make you sick. So if you've had influenza, H1N1, and you've gone through this whole body response, you're maintaining defenses against that very specific pathogen, and now you're immune. That only happens as part of our adaptive defenses. They're extremely specific. Now this means the first time you're exposed, our adaptive defenses are going to take a while, right? We can't immediately respond to them, but we actually gain immunity, the ability to not get sickened by that pathogen again, right? So the adaptive defenses are extremely specific, right? You can get influenza multiple times, but not the same strain, right, once you're immune to it. Okay, so I try to be careful when I talk about this, to talk about all of this as kind of the body's defenses. These innate defenses are not truly the immune system. I'll try not to be too picky about how you talk about it, right? But those innate defenses are non-specific, or adaptive defenses are extremely specific, and that is the true immune system. So let's start off looking at these innate defenses. There's actually quite a few of them. Things that before you read this chapter, maybe you had never even thought about being associated with the defense of your body, right? So the first one are these physical barriers, right? This is figure 2210, if you can't see this. Right? These physical barriers, it turns out intact, as in unbroken, intact skin and mucous membranes are a great defense, right? And this kind of makes sense. If you zoom in on the skin, if you recall this from AMP1, you had this stratified squamous epithelium. You have many, many layers of cells that it's really difficult for a pathogen, a bacteria or something to find its way through. If we go in the Wayback Machine here, think about skin, that stratified squamous epithelium, and this is true of skin and mucous membranes, right? Right, stratified squamous epithelium. So multiple different layers. And if you really think back, those cells are held together by desmosomes, right? So the cells are really well anchored together. It's going to be hard to get in between them. Remember these cells, particularly in the stratum corneum, they're filled with this keratin protein, right? This really tough protein. All those cells are dead. There's not really a lot of nutrients, maybe for our microbes there. Also associated with skin and mucous membranes, right? We have lots of different ways of protecting them, right? So even thinking about something like tears are constantly flushing the surface of your eye to remove potential pathogens. You also in tears have an enzyme called lysozyme, which acts to destroy bacteria. So some of these accessory structures to skin and mucous membrane can be really helpful in preventing invasion as well. Things like, well, let's not bubble up here, mucus, right? This is being produced either by salivary glands or structures up here in the nasal epithelium, and that's trapping potential pathogens, and then we remove them from the body, right? You have structures like cilia lining the mucous membranes in the trachea, right, to actually kind of propel that mucus-trapped microbe back out of the body. So you might not have thought about mucus as being protective, but that is its role. Also think about in the skin, even just stuff like your sweat glands, right? Sweat is slightly acidic. That's going to make it more difficult for a lot of microbes to colonize your skin. And then you even have your own microbiome. So we have bacteria on our skin already that can handle these acidic conditions, these dry conditions, these kind of hostile conditions, but that we get along, right? So they're our microbiome, and the fact that that surface is already colonized is going to make it harder for new pathogens to move in there as well, right? So intact skin and mucous membranes are actually quite useful. Okay, phagocytes. We've already talked about these. Can't spell. Right, our phagocytic cells, so I'll go through this fairly quickly. You learned about these with blood, but we're talking about white blood cells that are going to engulf and remove foreign pathogens, right? Remember our neutrophils, they're ingesting whatever that invader is, but remember they can only handle a dozen or 2 dozen bacteria before the gnarly chemicals, the enzymes that they're using, that they're going to destroy themselves in the process. They're my little kind of kamikaze pilots of the phagocytic cells. We talked about eosinophils, especially being useful in parasites, multicellular parasites, pathogens that are too big to truly engulf. A lot of times what we're going to do is we're going to tag that pathogen with an antibody, and then an eosinophil will know to go after that. Okay, and then our macrophages, right, the big eaters. Again, remember when they're in circulation, we call them a monocyte. When they move into tissues, they become macrophages. This is maybe my favorite picture in all of biology. This is a macrophage, and he's sticking out, he's reaching, right, this amoeboid movement, he's reaching out for this bacterial cell. Going to engulf that. And of course, macrophages just keep going and going. Now what we're pointing out here is that some are floating, right? They'll enter circulation, we'd call them a monocyte, and others end up fixed. So we were just talking about things like the spleen, lymph nodes, the thymus, those sorts of things. Those are places where we'll see macrophages hanging out, right, in the tissues. So I like this picture, talking about how, again, the plasma moves out of blood vessels, it becomes extracellular fluid, and then it moves into those lymphatic capillaries, we call it lymph, right? So it goes around. This RE, some people have started referring to this as a reticuloendothelial system, kind of all this connective tissue, places essentially where white blood cells can hang out. So some macrophages, right, move out of the bloodstream, okay, and hang out in the tissues, are looking for pathogens to consume as they come by, right? So some of our macrophages, again, are floating around, we would call monocytes, and then some are kind of fixed, right? They're in the spleen more or less consistently. Okay. We also, in our innate defenses, run immunological surveillance. So immunological surveillance, this is referring to the activity of natural killer cells, right? Natural killer cells, or NK cells, are very closely related to lymphocytes, right? They come from that lymphoid stem cell lineage. But what they're doing is they're kind of constantly screening, right, the surveillance, looking for foreign pathogens. This is our NK cell, and here it has found a cell. Now, the interesting thing with these guys, they can actually look for cells that are infected with a virus, they can look for cancerous cells, they can find pathogens, but here we see them just kind of scooting up next to him, at the bar, and then when it docks and realizes this is an infected cell, it's using a set of chemicals called perforins. Oh, there you go. I don't even have to write it. Perforins, and it's perforating, right? It's poking holes in this cell, and we see that resulting in lysis. Okay? So this immunological surveillance ends up being important. And again, we don't care if we've seen it before. This is completely non-specific. I'll say this. So that's kind of interesting. It's like, well, how do they even recognize this if they haven't seen it before? We talk about this some in microbiology, that a lot of microbes have like a set of proteins that we recognize in general as foreign. What is it? Pathogen-associated molecular, forgetting what the P is, PAMPs. Pathogen-associated molecular looking patterns, right? And so that can be used to recognize a whole slew of pathogens without being a specific response. Okay. Interferons. So interferons, oh boy. Okay. Interferons are chemical messengers that help cells protect against viral infection. So these are specific to protect against viral infection. So what ends up happening is lymphocytes, macrophages, or cells that have themselves been infected by a virus start putting out these little chemical messengers, and they're basically warning the neighbors to put up their defenses. Get it? Put up their fences, right? And it actually helps prevent neighboring cells from being infected by that same virus, okay? Complement system is a series of proteins that are circulating in blood all the time. I think it's like 20 different proteins that are circulating, and they complement the effect of antibodies. So antibodies are these little proteins that you're making that are trying to destroy the pathogen. Complement can also use that antibody kind of as a recognition, like, oh, this must be something bad if there's an antibody attached to it. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to destroy it. And the way that complement does this is it can do a couple things. It creates what's called a membrane attack complex. Here's a better picture. Okay, so what happens with complement is we see these proteins building this ring, right, embedding into the side of this bacteria. It's creating pores, and that can lead to lysis. So the complement system can create this membrane attack complex. and that leads to the lysis of that cell. Those proteins being embedded on the surface like that can also assist macrophages in engulfing, right, that bacterium. And so that's a process called opsonization. Opsonization is just the fancy way to say enhanced phagocytosis, which sounds pretty fancy too. Right, so helping macrophages actually get a hold of that bacteria and engulf it. And complement can also trigger the release of things like histamine, which will lead to inflammation, which is where we're heading next. So the complement system, these circulating proteins that are going to help us destroy pathogens, right, by exploding them or helping with phagocytosis. As promised, up next is the inflammatory response. Now, again, figure 2211, if you can't read this, because this is all small print, what we're looking at in the inflammatory response is this localized kind of tissue level response that's trying to limit the ability of a pathogen to kind of spread. And so you are very familiar with inflammation. You would recognize our signs and symptoms, right? So as the result of an injury, we have this very characteristic response, okay? Localized, tissue specific, and we have a few things happening here, and this is in the Latin, but if you speak any Spanish, this can help too, right? Rubor is redness, right? You picked that little hangnail, and now it's red, right? Rubor, that's part of the inflammatory response. Calor is heat, right? So it's warm. Tumor would be the swelling associated with inflammation, and then dolor is pain, right? So it gets painful, and then we tend not to use it, right? That might actually be a little protective here. So our signs and symptoms: redness, heat, swelling, and pain, okay, are a result of this inflammatory response. So what happens is we're always going to start with some kind of injury, okay? And we have a few things going on. The initial response is that vasoconstriction, just like we saw when we had blood vessel damage. So that's the immediate response, but what we're going to see is that cells in the area, these mast cells are essentially basophils that are now in the tissue. Mast cells are releasing histamine. So the vasoconstriction is going to let us get the blood loss under control, but then we want to respond to the site of injury because we're pretty sure if our skin is no longer intact, this is going to be a portal of entry for our pathogen. And histamine, if you'll recall, leads to vasodilation, but it also makes the blood vessels, the capillaries, very leaky. So histamine leads to vasodilation and leakiness, right? So our cells aren't held quite as closely together. And so what we see happening as a result, these yellow blobs are trying to show you plasma coming out of the blood vessels, but here come all our phagocytic cells, right? Our neutrophils, our macrophages are coming to the area to help. Now, this vasodilation is leading to increased blood flow, so we're getting redness and heat, right? The swelling, the leakiness of that vessel is leading to this accumulation of plasma, pus, right? All the dead neutrophils, dead bacteria, those sorts of things. But this swelling is actually useful in kind of walling off the infection from spreading as well. And then that swelling can push on nerve endings in the area, and so it becomes painful, right? And so you don't use that area. It's a little bit protective. Inflammation is a non-specific response to injury, happens all the time, and it's helping protect us from pathogens. Okay, last but not least, this is a big list of innate responses. Last but not least is fever. Not that fever, that fever, right? This increase in body temperature. Okay? This increase in body temperature is going to help us defend the body in two main ways, right? It decreases the ability of pathogens to replicate as quickly. Right? And I don't mean, like, your body temperature is really only going up a few degrees here, right? So we're used to 98.6 in Fahrenheit, 37 Celsius. You know, you're starting to run a fever once you get over, say, 99 or so, but you don't get very far, right? If you get above 104, we're really concerned, right? You're gonna start frying your own brain. So we're not really increasing temperatures enough to, like, straight up denature this pathogen, but if you've taken microbiology, you may have talked about like temperatures, right? An increasing temperature over here, and the reproductive rate of something like bacteria, and they have an optimum. Most of the pathogens that are able to make us sick have an optimum right around our body temperature, right? That's their preferred, and this is the point at which they're reproducing most rapidly. If you can bump them just a little bit, right, notice that decline in reproduction. So we're not just cooking them in a frying pan, but we're slowing them down, right? And that's useful. The other thing that it does is it increases our metabolism, right, particularly our white blood cells, increasing their activity, their ability to make enzymes and defend us, right? So a lot of times with fever, which portion of the brain is in charge of body temperature? Hypothalamus is correct. Right? So the hypothalamus is essentially your thermostat, right? It determines the temperature of the body. And what's going to happen is certain proteins, sometimes these are the proteins on the surface of a pathogen, they act as what are called pyrogens. We can also make our own pyrogens, but these pyrogens, these are proteins that are going to circulate, they go to the hypothalamus, and that tells the hypothalamus to turn up the thermostat, turn up the temperature, and gain these effects. Okay? So those are your innate defenses, right? You're born with these, they are non-specific, and then we'll move to the specific, the true immune system.